Due to the deep similarities between young Corax and young Angron, and due to the dark mirror between Sanguinius and Conrad Kurz, perhaps we should discuss the Raven Guard and contrast with the Night Lords. The early lives of the Primarchs played a huge role in shaping their personalities, leadership styles, and their ultimate fates. Corvus Corax's upbringing on Lycaeus, later renamed Deliverance, is particularly significant when compared to Conrad Kurz's early life on Nostromo, as well as to the more structured and civilized upbringings of, for example, Perturabo on Olympia or Rabute Gilliman on Macragge. Each Primarch's environment forged a distinct worldview, especially with regard to authority, morality, and justice. Lycaeus was a harsh prison moon orbiting the forge world of Kievar, ruled by the ruthless tech guilds. The prison functioned as a forced labor colony, with prisoners subjected to dehumanizing treatment. Corax grew up as a fugitive within the prison, surviving through stealth, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare. He experienced oppression firsthand and developed an intense and deep empathy for the downtrodden. Unlike some Primarchs, Corax was surrounded by prisoners, a population composed of workers, rebels, and criminals, but also innocent people, unjustly enslaved by the guilds, and political prisoners. Eventually, he led a slave rebellion, culminating in the overthrow of the tech guild's control of the moon, using his penchant for asymmetric warfare. Corax's guerrilla upbringing led to his mastery of stealth, sabotage, and subterfuge in warfare. This translated into his legion's later specialization in covert warfare, what we would currently think of as like special forces stuff, and hit-and-run tactics. Seeing the suffering of innocents during his youth influenced Corax's deep sense of justice. He sought to be a liberator, which sharply contrasts with the more authoritarian approaches of Primarchs like Perturabo and even Gilliman. Corax developed a disdain for ruling elites and those who abuse others from a position of power. This left him with a distrust of bureaucracy, nobility, and centralized authority. His Raven Guard reflected this, with a culture of meritocracy and suspicion towards excessive command hierarchies in the larger Imperium that led to them working independently. Similarly, Corax often isolated himself from his brothers, not just by having his legion operate independently. This trait, born from his time as a hunted fugitive, would remain with him throughout his life. He saw himself as a protector and liberator, but also as a lonely and tragic figure, and that only became more so after the betrayal and massacre at Istvan V. Meanwhile, Conrad Kurz grew up on Nostromo, a crime-ridden, industrialized nightmare world. The ruling elite controlled the impoverished masses through fear and crime, organized crime, while corruption and violence were daily realities. Unlike Corax, who grew up surrounded by potential allies, that is, the enslaved workers, Kurz grew up alone in the shadows of Nostromo's worst slums. Kurz survived as a lone vigilante, operating as a brutal killer of criminals. He executed his own brand of what he thought was justice, not through organized rebellion, but through a solo campaign of terror and murder. While justice was what they both thought they were going for, Corax sought to build an egalitarian society of liberated slaves, while Kurz sought to impose an autocratic order through absolute fear of him as an individual. He saw terror as the only way to maintain justice. Kurz's upbringing as a lone predator created a degree of psychological detachment. Unlike Corax, who grew up with a deep sense of empathy for other people, Kurz never saw himself as a person, and he saw suffering as a necessary tool of control. This led directly to his philosophical descent into nihilism, culminating in his belief that fate was inescapable. Kurz's prophetic visions, vaguely similar to those of Sanguinius, convinced him that he was destined for betrayal and death. This fatalism drove him to reject hope and morality, whereas Corax maintained belief in the potential for change. It's worth contrasting here. Perturabo on Olympia, which we'll get to later, it was an advanced, civilized world. It had a bunch of city-states which were constantly at war, and the upper class had some amount of structure and classical education. Unlike Lycaeus or Nostramo, Olympia had culture and civilization, even if it was heavily militarized. Perturabo was raised by Damachos, the tyrant of Lochos, and trained as a warlord and military strategist. Unlike Corax, who wasn't really trained by one father figure in most canon, who fought with guerrilla tactics and subversion, or Kurz, who had no one and fought as a lone predator, Perturabo learned the arts of siege warfare, fortification, and grand strategy from real tutors. Corax was beloved by his people, and Kurz was hated but feared. But Perturabo was just viewed as a tool by his adoptive father. This lack of love and recognition would scar him for life. Perturabo developed a profound bitterness towards the concept of duty. He believed himself to be underappreciated and exploited, which later fueled his rebellion against the emperor. Unlike Corax, who sought to protect life, Perturabo viewed human lives as expendable resources. This is evident in his tactics, but also in his relationships to his own marines. While Corax and Kurz operated from the shadows, Perturabo sought control through architecture, fortification, strict hierarchy, and complete mastery of his environment. His obsession with perfection contrasts with Corax's ability to thrive in uncertainty. Similar to Perturabo in many ways, Rabute Gilliman's upbringing on Macragge was civilized, orderly, and prosperous. It was governed with a functional government with clear laws and a strong economy, as well as some amount of interstellar capability. Unlike the chaos of Nostramo or the oppression of Lycaeus, Macragge provided Gilliman with a clear sense of order, reason, and structure. Gilliman was not a rebel or vigilante. He was a reformer who did his best to enhance and improve the existing government of Macragge and its surrounding worlds in the memory of his father, Connor. Gilliman, because of his upbringing, believed in the power of institutions and codified laws. Unlike Corax, who distrusted hierarchy because he saw how those in power tended to oppress the less powerful, Gilliman saw systems as a source of order and stability. Corax mastered guerrilla warfare, but Gilliman did his best with combined arms total war. Gilliman's leadership relied on strategy and logistics, whereas Corax focused on sabotage and surprise. While Corax believed in liberation from tyranny, Gilliman believed in building better institutions. His focus on gradual improvement and the long game sets him apart from the Primarchs raised in hardship, making him have a different perspective which allows him to accomplish different things, but also means that he's less able to see or care about the immense suffering of the average citizen in the Imperium. And so we can see the early lives of the Primarchs define their moral outlook, leadership style and their capacity for hope. Corax and Kurs are in some ways dark reflections of one another. Both experienced suffering, both fought from the shadows, and both saw the failures of power and authority structures. But where Corax sought to redeem and liberate, Kurs embraced despair and terror. Meanwhile, Perturabo and Guilliman also function as inversions of one another, though not the best pair for like a fellowship. We'll get to that later. Both of them understood the importance of strategy and structure, and while Guilliman grew up with institutions and learned to trust systems, Perturabo grew up with institutions and grew to hate them. Where Guilliman saw hope, Perturabo saw only futility and exploitation. If Corax had been raised on Nostromo, he might have become another Kurs, turning his guerrilla tactics into a personal crusade of terror. If Kurs had been raised on Lysaeus, perhaps he would have inspired a rebellion similar to Corax's, and his personal connections with the other prisoners would have led him to have greater control over his own darkness. Rather than becoming a violent, uncompromising warlord, he might instead have become a liberator. The environments of the Primarchs thus show us great insight into the power of nature versus nurture. Surrounded by prisoners, maintained hope for freedom. Kurs, surrounded by criminals, embraced hopelessness. Their shared capacity for stealth and terror was their greatest similarity, but the use they put it to was their greatest division. We shall, as you may have guessed, be spending quite a bit of time talking about the Primarch Corvus Corax, the Raven Lord, Primarch of the Raven Guard. Let's take a look at how the circumstances of his early life impacted his development and character. Early in his career as Primarch, prior to meeting, according to the canon I remember, which may or may not still apply, the Emperor came to Lysaeus personally and met with Corax, then left him to fight his own battle. This is in stark contrast to his treatment of Angron or Mortarion. It would seem that the Emperor was placing a much greater measure of trust and confidence in Corax than in some of his brothers. How does this inform our understanding of the Emperor's character or the character of Corax? How does this impact Corax's growth and development and his relationship with the Emperor? I feel that, as always, the first meeting between a Primarch and the Emperor is a key point for understanding both the Emperor's leadership philosophy and the Primarch's self-conception. The Emperor's decision to allow Corax to complete the liberation of Lysaeus on his own stands in contrast to his direct intervention on behalf of Mortarion, killing Mortarion's father Nicare, and his rescue of Angron against Angron's wishes. This has long-term consequences for Corax's view of himself, his trust in authority figures, and his relationship with the Emperor. So, during Corax's rebellion against the tech guilds of Kievar, the Emperor arrived on Lysaeus and spoke with Corax. We don't know what went on there. And then he left and showed up again later after Corax had finished. The Emperor, I'll reiterate, approached Corax alone and without an army, emphasizing his ability to command respect through presence and charisma alone. Not the first time he's done that. He did that with Sanguinius. He did that with Mortarion. He did that with Russ. Anyway, unlike certain other Primarchs like Russ or Ferrus Manus, there was no violent challenge or test of strength. There was no need for the Emperor to prove his authority to Corax. Corax had long fought for freedom and recognized the Emperor's power not just as an oppressor, but also as the potential for being a liberator. Instead of commanding Corax to leave his people and join the Great Crusade immediately, like with Angron, the Emperor allowed Corax to remain for a time to complete his revolution, to finish his rebellion. This is unique. Primarchs like Mortarion and Angron were pulled away from their worlds at pivotal moments. The Emperor's approach to Corax reflects his evolving attitude towards his sons. He had some degree of trust in autonomy by this point. By letting Corax finish his fight, the Emperor displayed an unusual level of trust in Corax's competence and moral compass. This is notably different from his intervention with Angron on Nuceria, where he forcibly teleported Angron away, robbing Angron of the chance to fight alongside his friends, the gladiators. In contrast, the Emperor treated Corax as a fully realized being, an adult, a leadership figure, not a tool to be seized or controlled. The message here was clear. You are worthy. I trust you. This is a sharp divergence from how the Emperor treated many, many other Primarchs. The Emperor recognized that The Emperor recognized that Corax, having grown up in an environment of constant rebellion and subterfuge, would view authoritarian oversight and heavy-handedness as a prelude to tyranny. By showing restraint, the Emperor fostered trust between the two of them, rather than eventual rebellion. This was nearly the opposite of his strategy with Angron, or Mortarion, for whom the Emperor's direct intervention, sowed lasting resentment. The Emperor saw a man capable of self-governance, one who could lead without being micromanaged. This decision mirrors his eventual, though perhaps flawed, decision to leave the Imperium in the hands of the Primarchs and Malcador, while he, the Emperor, focused on the Webway project. This meeting and its outcome had substantial effects on Corax's personality, self-perception, and leadership. Corax had spent his life learning to lead from the shadows, plan ambushes, and conduct war on his terms. The Emperor's decision to let him finish the revolution validated Corax's methods. It reinforced Corax's belief in the power of autonomy, personal responsibility, interpersonal trust, and guerrilla tactics, which he would later apply to the Raven Guard's doctrine. The Raven Guard would become known for their independent command and their self-reliance. While many Primarchs served the Emperor out of obligation, pride, or necessity, Corax had actual loyalty. The Emperor's trust in him to finish what he had started created a bond of mutual respect. Corax didn't follow out of fear or compulsion, but because he saw the Emperor as a figure who understood and respected his struggle. The difference between Corax and Angron is thrown into sharp relief here. Angron was torn from his people and left with a festering wound of unresolved conflict. But Corax was allowed to finish the revolution that he had started on his own terms. While Angron would always resent the Emperor for that loss, Corax felt a sense of unity with his father, at least until the Emperor's death. From these comparisons, it's clear that the Emperor's approach to Corax was one of his most hands-off and respectful meetings with any of the Primarchs. I say one of because we can't really know about the lost Primarchs. Anyway, this contrasts sharply with his handling of Angron, where he forcibly extracted him from his world. Lorgar, where he just sort of stuck around and didn't really respect what Lorgar was doing. Or Mortarion, where he's like, you can't do this, I'll do it for you. The results were clear. Corax was one of the most loyal of the Primarchs, whereas Angron and Lorgar and Mortarion eventually turned against the Emperor. Now, there was some strain in their relationship, especially after the Istvan V dropsite massacre. That massacre broke Corax's spirit. After suffering the near total destruction of his legion, Corax returned to Terra to ask for help in rebuilding. The Emperor gave him some secrets of gene forging, trusting him once again to act independently to rebuild the Raven Guard. However, this act of trust backfired. The process was corrupted, resulting in horribly mutated Raven Guard. The very methods that had once made Corax feel competent and worthy now became a source of doubt. This sense of guilt and failure after Istvan V in some ways mirrors the experience of Lorgar after Monarchia. Lorgar felt abandoned by the Emperor, so he in turn rebelled against the Emperor. Corax felt unworthy of his trust, but he continued to struggle towards fulfilling his father's expectations. After the heresy, Corax felt that he had completely failed the Emperor's trust in him. The tragedy of the mutated Raven Guard, the inability of the Raven Guard to participate meaningfully in the Battle of Terra, all of this just compounded his feelings. His decision then to leave his legion and wander into self-imposed exile may have been motivated by the fact that his relationship with the Emperor was built on trust. Having thus felt like he violated that trust, Corax felt unworthy of command. Perhaps we can see the same pattern appear in Vulcan's exile after having been tortured at the hands of Kurz during Kurz's spiral into nihilism. When Primarchs lose faith in their role within the Emperor's design, they become lost. What we can see from the example of Corax is that trust creates loyalty. The Emperor's decision to give Corax autonomy inspired a bond of respect. Had the Emperor applied the same approach to Angron, perhaps helping him to liberate Nuceria, it is possible that Angron would have felt less betrayed. If he had trusted Mortarian's abilities, it is possible that Mortarian would have been thankful for receiving help. The best way to earn loyalty is to empower them to complete their own goals. Corax didn't need to be rescued, he needed to be trusted. Now, autonomy is a double-edged sword. The Emperor's hands-off approach to leadership worked with Corax, but it completely failed with Conrad Kurz, who had no guidance, or with Perturabo, who felt abandoned. The same approach would have been a disaster for Angron, who needed emotional support, not control. The first meeting of Corax and the Emperor tells us that trust can create loyalty, whereas control can lead to rebellion. The Emperor's decision to give Corax autonomy led to one of the most unshakably loyalist Primarchs of the heresy. The story of Corax and the Emperor is thus one of the few times where the Emperor's hands-off preferred approach actually worked. It shows us that, despite his flaws, the Emperor could recognize when it was a good idea to be a liberator rather than a conqueror. For Corax, this moment affirmed his belief that his fight for justice had meaning. That belief sustained him even after Istvan V. Now let's take a look at the early life of Corax after meeting the Emperor. How did the Raven Guard react and change once united with their Primarch? How can Corax's early influence be seen in the Legion's pre-heresy deeds, such as the first Itvan compliance campaigns? And which of their earlier pre-Primarch influences were still visible after meeting him? As with all of the Legions, except maybe the Wordbearers, when Corvus Corax was united with the Raven Guard, the Legion underwent a profound transformation in tactics, culture, and overall strategic philosophy, making them much better at fighting. The introduction of Corax's ideals, drawn from his upbringing on Lycaeus, now called Deliverance, had a lasting impact on the Legion. However, some elements of the Legion's earlier Terran influences persisted, creating a hybrid identity that would endure through the Great Crusade and into the Horus Heresy. Before Corax's arrival, the Raven Guard, who I believe were originally known as the Deliverers, had distinct characteristics rooted in their Terran origins. These early Marines were shaped by the warlords and warrior cults of Terra's unification wars. Many of the legionnaires came from grim, hardline, militaristic backgrounds, especially Albia, one of Terra's most famously stubborn, independent regions. These Albia origin soldiers had a stoic, dour, and unyielding ethos, which emphasized strength, discipline, and brutal efficiency. Without Corax's influence, the pre-Corax Raven Guard fought more like a traditional legion. They preferred direct engagements, siege tactics, formal compliance campaigns, standard combined arms sort of tactics. They were much less reliant on stealth, ambush, or hit-and-run tactics, instead favoring overwhelming force. The pre-Corax Raven Guard had a harsher, more militant aesthetic. They leaned into the idea of being the Emperor's hammer, smashing opposition into submission. Their early livery had symbolism not focused so much on the raven, but more on the imagery of unrelenting power and implacable fate. These elements established the foundation of the Legion's early identity, which would then be shifted upon Corax's meeting them. When Corax joined his legion, he was confronted with an army that resembled the iron-hearted pragmatism of Albia, rather than the ideals of the liberationist philosophy he had honed on Lycaeus. Corax set out to reform the Legion, shifting it to match his personal ideals and methods. He introduced guerrilla warfare and covert tactics to the Raven Guard. The formalized set-piece battle mentality of the Terran warriors was mostly abandoned in favor of stealth, ambush, and precision strikes. This change mirrored the way Corax had led his revolution on Lycaeus, where he relied on surprise attacks, asymmetric warfare, and the strategic use of limited resources. The Legion became specialists in striking from the shadows and then vanishing before retaliation. Their missions often involved decapitating the enemy leadership structure and disrupting command structures, rather than prolonging engagements in a long, drawn-out war of attrition. And while not as overtly horrific as the Night Lords, they didn't target civilians and stuff, the Raven Guard did embrace the use of fear as a psychological weapon against enemy armies. The knowledge that death could come from unseen shadows became a potent weapon in their arsenal. Corax was shaped by the anti-tyrannical ideals of the prisoners of Lycaeus, and he instilled these same ideals into his legion. The Raven Guard's point was not to wage war for conquest, glory, or brutality. It was to liberate the oppressed and bring humanity together. Corax rejected unnecessary bloodshed and took efforts to avoid civilian casualties when possible. This focus on freedom and liberation thus put the Raven Guard at odds with other legions like the World Eaters and Night Lords, whose methods were much more brutal. Corax viewed war as a necessary evil, while many of his brothers, like Angron or Kurz, viewed it as an inescapable reality, or even a form of justice. Corax drew fresh recruits from the liberated population of Lycaeus, bringing them into the ranks of his legion. These new deliverance origin Marines were ideologically aligned with Corax's ideals, many of them having fought with him while they were still humans, unlike the more stoic, hardline Terran origin Marines. This created a dual identity within the Legion. The Terran veterans were hardened warriors from the Unification Wars, who valued brute force and combined arms fighting, whereas the Deliverance origin Marines were rebels and freedom fighters who embraced subterfuge, liberation, and asymmetric warfare. This division between Terran origin and new homeworld origin Marines can also be seen in other legions. And over time, in all of the various legions then, the Deliverance-born Marines, the Marines from the new homeworld, grew to match the numbers of the Terrans and then overcame the Terran numbers, and the way of the new homeworld became the norm. During the Great Crusade, the Raven Guard fought in numerous compliance campaigns wherein the influence of Corax's philosophy could be seen. If I remember right, Corax was in charge of 3 of the expeditionary fleets. I'm not going to look up what numbers they were. I don't care. The Raven Guard, though, often deployed separately from other legions, which allowed them to operate in their preferred covert manner. This separation allowed them to use their independence and self-reliance. Most notably, the Istvan compliance campaigns, not the Istvan battles of the heresy. The Istvan system saw multiple compliance campaigns in which the Raven Guard fought alongside the Iron Hands and Salamanders. During these campaigns, the Raven Guard's ability to infiltrate enemy strongholds and cripple their leadership was on full display. Unlike the Iron Hands' unyielding assault doctrine, or the Salamander's use of fire in warfare, the Raven Guard's focus in warfare was on destroying enemy command structures as their priority, using psychological terror and tactical assassination to hasten their victory. Over time, the Terran-born siege warfare veterans were forced to adapt to the new philosophy of shadow warfare. Veterans who once prized heavy assault tactics were now fighting with a great deal of use of jump packs, reconnaissance, and infiltration. This change mirrors similar culture clashes seen in other legions, but with great effect. Now, this wasn't always a great thing. The World Eaters were turned from disciplined assault troops into frenzied berserkers by Angron. Corax, thankfully, made a positive change in his legion. Now, despite Corax's overhaul of the Raven Guard, some pre-Corax influences persisted. The original Terran-born Marines from Albia retained their culture of grim determination and unyielding resolve. This is reflected in the stoicism that defined the Raven Guard's attitude during the heresy, especially following the Istvan V massacre, when their small number of survivors were faced with the possibility of the annihilation of their legion. Their capacity to endure and fight against impossible odds owes much to the early Terran influence. While Corax disdained siege warfare, the knowledge and technical expertise of his Terran origin Marines in fortification and engineering remained quite useful. The ability to set up ambushes, prepare defensible positions, and understand how to dismantle an enemy fortress was still useful, even if it was no longer the Legion's preferred method of war. Even after the Horus Heresy, and even after Corax's disappearance, the guerrilla warfare asymmetric philosophy of Corax remained the core of the Raven Guard and some of their subsequent founding chapters. This approach was the primary strategy in the Raven Guard's various campaigns, notably in the Scouring, wherein the Raven Guard waged a secret, drawn-out campaign of vengeance against the traitors. The use of shadows, darkness, and fear as weapons and symbols became central to the Raven Guard's imagery and iconography. After the heresy, this symbolism would also be seen in various successor chapters, who continued to employ ambush, subterfuge, and terror tactics. Corax's influence created a legion that valued secrecy, intelligence, and independence. Later chapters would embrace various offshoot forms of this ideal. The arrival of Corax transformed the Raven Guard from a traditional set-piece battle combined arms legion into an elite force of stealth operatives, assassins, and guerrilla warriors. He changed not only their tactics, but also their ethos, imbuing them with the belief that they fought not for conquest alone, instead also fighting for freedom and justice. While Terran influences remained, Corax's ideas ultimately won out, turning the Raven Guard Legion into one defined by independence, secrecy, and liberation. And their philosophy would endure even after the massacre at Istvan V and the betrayal of the Horus Heresy. Prior to meeting Corax, the Raven Guard Legion were mostly used as an allied force attached to the Luna Wolves, who were a bit less stealthy than even the pre-Corax Raven Guard. This change from their close alliance to their later isolation and independent operations was perhaps an extreme change on the part of Corax. It was almost the reverse of what Sanguinius did with his apprenticeship of the Revenant with other legions. In both cases, it seems to have worked out okay. To reiterate, the Raven Guard shifted from alliance-based complementary warfare into isolationist, self-reliant, independent action when Corvus Corax took control of them. Whereas when Sanguinius took control of the Revenant Legion and made them into the Blood Angels, he had them fight alongside other legions he considered to be honorable in order to change their behavior. Now, these were both successful, but in different ways, and the differences show us distinctions in leadership philosophy and cultural transformation between the two Primarchs. Before their respective Primarchs took control, the Raven Guard and Blood Angels, the Deliverers and the Revenants, had distinct battlefield roles already within the Emperor's grand strategy of the Great Crusade. The Raven Guard, though not as stealthy as they would become under Corax, were still stealthier than many other legions. So they had a role as an auxiliary detachment for the Luna Wolves, for the most part. They were used as an infiltration and sabotage force. This role required them to work in the shadows, while the Luna Wolves, under Horus, engaged in open battle, set-piece warfare with standard combined arms stuff. This was useful for short-term campaigns, but if it had persisted, it would have suborned the Raven Guard's identity under that of the Luna Wolves, preventing them from developing a clear sense of independence. Meanwhile, the Revenant, before Sanguinius made them into the Blood Angels, had no strong attachment to any particular legion. They were sent in as berserk shock troops, like the early Space Wolves. They relied on raw ferocity and close-quarters brutality. Many other legions wanted nothing to do with them. Without a steady allied partner, they developed a culture of self-reliance driven by savagery, not control or strategy. This placed them closer in function to the Warhounds, or World Eaters, but without the extra layer of command and control that was later imposed by Angron's butcher's nails on the World Eaters. When Corax and Sanguinius were reunited with their respective legions, they each identified what they saw as flaws or weaknesses within their forces, and sought to change their identity and purpose according to their own tactical doctrine. The methods they chose show us much about their characters. Corax realized that isolation was empowerment. He knew that his legion had been used as an auxiliary force under the Luna Wolves, and he sought to break them away from that role. His method was radical self-reliance, shifting his legion from collaboration with allies to a self-sufficient shadow warrior idea. He reasoned that the Raven Guard could only master their own form of warfare if they operated alone, without the distractions of other forces. This is somewhat similar to the behavior of Conrad Kurz and the Night Lords, but while Kurz used isolation to brood on nihilism and terror and sink deeper into depths that others would not have tolerated, Corax used isolation to master precision and purpose. Sanguinius approached the same goal of cultural transformation, but from the opposite direction. He used integration as empowerment. Rather than break ties with other legions, Sanguinius sought collaboration, having the Revenant fight alongside other legions that he thought of as being noble and honorable, in order to inspire the Revenant by their example, while Corax's strategy was to reject outside influence. Sanguinius' strategy was to embrace and learn from it. The Blood Angels' newfound appreciation for artistic pursuits, honor, and nobility reflects how much they internalized these lessons. And so we can see that Corax sought isolation to find his legion's true nature, whereas Sanguinius sought mentorship to refine his legion's true nature. Over time, both Primarchs achieved success, but in different ways. By embracing isolation, the Raven Guard became self-sufficient. They developed a mastery of sabotage, infiltration, guerrilla tactics, and asymmetric warfare that no other legion could match, though the Alpha Legion and Night Lords tried. However, this independence also came with a weakness. The Raven Guard had fewer allies and worked with lesser external support. This was a critical weakness during the drop site massacre at Istvan V, wherein that isolation left them more vulnerable to betrayal. By learning from other legions, the Blood Angels, meanwhile, became kind of a hybrid legion. They had the nobility and discipline of the Ultramarines or Imperial Fists, with their own savage fury, channeled into righteous courage. Their pursuit of beauty and artistry, while noble, was also a means of trying to master their own inner flaws, the red thirst and later the black rage, echoes of their own berserker nature, and the tragedies of their legion. The Blood Angels' openness to inspiration made them one of the most universally beloved legions, but it also meant that they carried a heavy burden in the form of spiritual and psychological struggles. The philosophies adopted by Sanguinius and Corax continued to influence the legions during the heresy as well. The Raven Guard were betrayed during the Drop Site Massacre, alongside the Iron Hands and Salamanders. Their strategy of isolation thus ironically left them exposed, as they had no close allies to warn them of Horus's treachery. Corax's belief in radical independence would later fuel his refusal to collaborate, even in the heresy's aftermath, although this was also fueled by the Iron Hands' unwillingness to fight alongside the Raven Guard, who they blamed in part for the death of Ferrus Manus, unfairly. Meanwhile, the Blood Angels' belief in redemption and hope was tested when they were sent to Cygnus Prime as a trap orchestrated by Chaos. Sanguinius faced the Chaos Daemon Kabanda, and the ripples of that battle would be a psychic trauma remaining with the Blood Angels forever. Despite this, Sanguinius' openness to collaboration and mentorship ultimately allowed his legion to remain one of the most beloved of the loyalist legions. And so we can see that isolation versus integration is one of the themes of Primarch leadership in the lead-up to the Horus heresy. Whereas Corax sought independence for his legion, and while it created the greatest stealth warriors in the Imperium, it left them vulnerable to betrayal because they lacked allies. Sanguinius's path of integration, he sought collaboration with honorable legions. They created warriors of nobility, honor, and artistic sensibility, but it also perhaps left them exposed to their psychological curses in their genes, the red thirst and the black rage. It's hard to tell how much the one helped or hindered in dealing with the other. I wonder if they might have been able to learn from each other if they had been a bit closer. If Corax had embraced the Blood Angels as allies, if he had been more willing to speak with others in general, perhaps he could have gotten a better path out of Istvan. But what can you do? That's the what if. I think we can see some similarities between the Terran origin Raven Guards' outlook and that of the Iron Hands and Iron Warriors. I wonder how much of this was the influence of the Luna Wolves on the Raven Guard. We might also consider how Corax was influenced by other Primarchs upon meeting them. The Luna Wolves, later renamed the Sons of Horus, were renowned for their tactical versatility, rapid deployment, shock assault strategy, and Horus's ability to use them alongside other complementary legions for a combined arms approach. I think that their methods had some influence on the Raven Guard. They had some tactical cross-pollination. Before Corax took full control of the Raven Guard, the Legion often fought alongside the Luna Wolves as part of the Emperor's strategy to reinforce some legions, which were smaller, with other more experienced, already established forces. As the first legion to be unified with their Primarch, the Luna Wolves were already operating with the confidence, experience, and charisma of Horus as their leader. Fighting alongside the Luna Wolves thus exposed the Raven Guard to flexible tactics and shock assault methods. The Luna Wolves prioritized rapid, overwhelming force at the key moment of a battle, a concept that likely helped inspire the Raven Guard's later emphasis on surgical decapitation strikes. The Luna Wolves were masters of decisive engagement with an emphasis on adaptability and seizing the initiative with the use of combined arms to bring best effect to the battlefield. This shows us in some way the Raven Guard's later emphasis on precision strikes, although the Raven Guard's approach was far more covert, prioritizing subterfuge over sheer momentum. Horus was the highly charismatic leader of the Imperium, able to inspire fierce loyalty in his legion and forge alliances with other Primarchs, whereas Corax, in contrast, was solitary, brooding, and introspective, keeping a psychological distance from his brothers, and even from his own legion. While the Luna Wolves focused on seizing glory for the War Master and demonstrating their prowess on the battlefield, Corax emphasized moral clarity and the ethical pursuit of freedom. Horus valued the strength of the Legion as a collective whole, whereas Corax emphasized the value of the individual. The Raven Guard's identity thus grew into something less reliant on grandeur and charisma, or public accolade and glory, unlike the Luna Wolves. The Raven Guard did not strive for spectacle or prestige, only victory. While Corax's approach focused on stealth and ambush, his tactical philosophy had some overlap with Horus's concept of decisive intervention at the critical moment. Both legions, of course, preferred to attack an enemy's weak point to try to decapitate their leadership. That's just standard military doctrine, you know. The Luna Wolves would attack with overwhelming force, using the combined arms of various different weapons available to them, whereas the Raven Guard preferred to cripple their enemy from the shadows. But in both cases, the result was the same. You disrupt the enemy command structure and end the campaign quickly. The Raven Guard's use of drop pod insertions and jump pack assaults echoed the Luna Wolves' use of shock troop movements, but Raven Guard assaults generally featured fewer troops and relied more on stealth. Both legions shared an understanding of target prioritization, focusing on striking at critical objectives to force the enemy to collapse. However, both certain influences of the Luna Wolves, notably some of their more distasteful compliance campaigns alongside the Raven Guard, and the influence of the Xeric tribes of Terra, caused Corax pause. He didn't want those influences in his legion. They were too reminiscent of the tech guilds of Kievar, the tyranny. Once he took control of the Raven Guard, he took some pains to distance them from power and reassign Terran origin officers like former Legion Master Arcus Fall into non-command roles. Unlike Horus, who had a strong rapport with most of his brothers, Corax was distant and solitary. This distance was born from his experience on Deliverance, where he had been a revolutionary leader who carried the burden of leadership alone. Corax viewed many of his brothers with mistrust, especially those whose ideologies or methods he found reprehensible. Corax, so far as I can tell from the canon I've read, had no formal mentorship from other Primarchs, and coming from an already established advanced technology world, didn't have much in the way of an acclimation period. But he did have a few key relationships. Horus Lupercal, strangely. Lupercal? Lupercal. Horus maintained a rapport with many of his brothers as the Emperor's favored son and war master. Corax respected Horus as a capable strategist, and given their shared presence in some early campaigns of Corax's career, it's conceivable that Horus's charisma and tactical insight left an imprint on Corax's strategic thinking. Thus, when Horus betrayed them, this betrayal shook Corax deeply. The hard pragmatism of Ferrus Manus and Corax had some points of overlap. Both were grim, uncompromising, and ideal-driven. Ferrus's mechanical logic and Corax's calculated minimalism may have shared some conceptual ground, but their temperaments were very different. Ferrus embraced the cold, mechanistic nature of war, whereas Corax fought more to liberate civilians. But their pragmatic approaches to tactics meant that the two were able to collaborate in campaigns. Of the various Primarchs, Vulcan was perhaps the closest ideological match for Corax. He valued the protection of humanity, while Corax valued liberation of humanity from tyranny. This alignment of moral philosophy made them natural allies, and thus that's why Corax, Vulcan, and Ferrus Manus were all very close at Istvan V. Kurz, meanwhile, was a dark mirror to Corax. Both Primarchs shared gifts for operating in the shadows, but where Corax used fear as a tactical tool, Kurz seemed to use it as an end in itself. Corax believed in liberation, while Kurz believed in punishment and domination. Their animosity just grew and grew as Kurz's methods became more sadistic, and their relationship was one of mutual disdain. Corax had few close allies in the Imperium. He had a handful of strategic and ideological allies among his brothers, though. Vulcan, we mentioned. Rabute Gilliman of the Ultramarines. Corax's and Gilliman's approaches made them natural collaborators in certain campaigns in which measured, methodical action was required, but could be supplemented by covert action. Lionel Johnson and Corax both valued stealth and secrecy in their methods, but while Lion valued strategic deception, I suppose, Corax valued guerrilla warfare. they collaborated sometimes. Corax worked well with the Imperial Army, sometimes the Mechanicum, the Imperial Armada, which is what the Imperial Navy was called, but not so much more than other Primarchs. That was just part of running a legion, you know? There was some friction with some other Primarchs, though. Angron especially. Corax despised senseless violence, and he viewed Angron's bloodlust and killing of civilians as utterly abhorrent. Corax was disdainful and mistrusting of Lorgar's religious fanaticism. He saw it as foolish and irrational. And we already mentioned Kurs. We need not retread that ground. Now, what if Corax had a formal mentor? He was found pretty late. He had his choice of them. I think that the most logical candidate for a formal mentor would have been Vulcan. His compassion and his legion's protection of the innocent would have worked nicely there. Or, already having that idea, he could have been paired with Rabute Gilliman or Lionel Johnson for their tactical and strategic brilliance. Of course, then again, we know from the example of Alfarius that Rabute Gilliman saw himself as kind of above his brothers. Given his distance from others, Corax might not have embraced any mentor figure, but if he had been assigned a mentor, I feel that Vulcan would have been the most effective match. In the end, Corax's alliances and influences shaped a legion of ghosts and shadows, one that fought not primarily for conquest, but for freedom and liberation. His isolation, like that of, say, Jagatai Khan, became both a strength of his legion and a weakness. The Istvan V dropsite massacre was Horus's greatest betrayal of Corax, but it could be argued that it was not the first time he had betrayed Corax. That might have been Horus refusing to heed Corax's advice. Corvus Corax had a complicated relationship with many of his brothers. While some, like Vulcan, shared his moral principles, others had worldviews that clashed profoundly with his. Corax was a pragmatist, idealist, and isolationist, and these traits led him to both collaborate with and oppose his fellow Primarchs at different times. Let's take a look at some key moments of friction between Corax and his brothers, looking at his early estrangement from Horus and the others leading up to and during the Horus heresy. The first moment of betrayal between Horus and Corax was Horus dismissing Corax's advice in the lead up to what we would call the Battle of Gate 42. Because of this, Corax's relationship with Horus had soured long before the Dropsite Massacre at Istvan V. They had a fundamental clash of ideology and tactical approach. Corax valued liberation, minimal collateral damage, ethical leadership, and did his best to fight the enemy on his own terms in order to take the fewest casualties possible. Whereas Horus pursued glory, conquest, and quick, efficient victory. Their differences became clear as Corax advocated for stealthy approaches in compliance campaigns, while Horus, as War Master, prioritized glory and domination. During the early planning stages of what would be called the Battle of Gate 42, which we'll talk to in more detail later, Corax advised Horus to adopt a stealth-based approach, a diversionary attack, in order to end up suffering fewer casualties. Corax argued that deception and precision strikes could minimize casualties and catch their enemy off guard. Horus, and also Perturabo, dismissed this plan, preferring a more overt hammer blow strategy, which ultimately led to a great number of casualties. This refusal to listen was the first betrayal of Corax. It signaled that Horus valued brute strength over Corax's strategic advice. After the Battle of Istvan V, later, Corax recognized that Horus had knowingly led the Raven Guard into a trap, and this may have led him to be suspicious about whether Gate 42 had earlier been an intentional trap. For Corax, Istvan V was a personal betrayal as much as a military one. Thus, we can see the beginning of Corax's personal war against Horus, where he adopted guerrilla warfare tactics to bleed the traitors from the shadows with the few numbers he had available throughout the heresy. He had some lasting friction with Conrad Kurs of the Night Lords because they were two sides of the same coin. He was the most direct philosophical opposite to Corax, but their legions had substantial tactical similarities, which only served to highlight their differences. Both of them grew up in oppressive environments, Corax leading a revolution to liberate the oppressed, with Kurs pursuing a campaign of terror and control. Both of them valued the use of fear as a weapon, but while Corax used it to undermine tyrants, Kurs used it to dominate and terrorize populations. They had similar beginnings, but took different paths. Kurs believed that the end justified the means, embracing torture, slaughter, and psychological torment to enforce order. Corax believed in restraint and mercy, fighting only as much as was necessary to win. Their moral views were thus diametrically opposed, and Kurs took pride in the horror and fear he inspired, while Corax sought to avoid his legion becoming monsters. Their philosophical and tactical divergence during the Great Crusade was profound. Corax was known to criticize Primarchs like Angron and Kurs, who caused excessive civilian casualties. He believed that the Primarchs inherently were at risk of becoming the tyrants that he fought to overthrow. The most substantial moment of confrontation between the two was, of course, Istvan V, wherein Kurs fought with the Night Lords against the Raven Guard at the Dropsite Massacre, and afterwards actively hunted the survivors. Corax had to lead his wounded legion through guerrilla warfare tactics to try to survive and escape. The ruthlessness of Kurs's Night Lords and their own skill made this retreat even more grueling for Corax, cementing his hatred for Kurs. Meanwhile, Angron was nothing like Corax. He was a mindless beast, not a calculating revolutionary. Angron's savagery, bloodlust, and complete willingness to cause civilian casualties were all anathema to Corax. As someone who fought to liberate the oppressed on deliverance, Corax viewed uncontrolled violence as tyranny. He believed that warriors should exercise restraint, while Angron saw war as a catharsis for rage. The World Eater's battle doctrine of brute force assaults and mass bloodshed was the complete opposite of the subtlety and precision preferred by the Raven Guard. It's unlikely that Corax and Angron could have ever fought together effectively. Angron saw Corax's restraint and stealth as cowardice, whereas Corax accurately saw Angron's tactics as barbaric and self-destructive. Angron was among the traitors at Istvan V, fighting alongside the first wave with Horus. But he was not subtle about his treachery, as was, for example, Perturabo. While Horus lured the loyalists into a trap, Angron led the slaughter of them. Corax witnessed Angron's unrelenting violence firsthand, and any remaining respect that Corax had for his brother was lost on the killing fields of Istvan V. These rifts highlight Corax's most enduring trait, his absolute commitment to freedom and liberation. The treachery of Istvan V was a profound philosophical betrayal of everything Corax believed in, at the same time that it was a physical destruction of the Raven Guard as a major force. His isolation grew deeper after that, and his reliance on isolationist tactics mirrored his inner sense of betrayal and self-imposed exile. Corax's entire arc revolves around his rejection of tyranny and his refusal to compromise on his moral beliefs. This trait puts him at odds with most of his brothers. Okay, before we get too deep into the heresy stuff, Great Crusade, let's discuss the Battle of Gate 42, the Aucum Sothos cluster campaign, and more specifically, the Battle of Gate 42 represent a pivotal moment in Corax's relationship with his brothers, especially Horus Lupercal. Lupercal? I'm still not sure. Horus Lupercal and Perturabo. This event highlights not only Corax's strategic acumen, but also the dismissal of his counsel by his more prideful brothers. Okay, so context first. The Aucum Sothos cluster was a strategically important region of the Great Crusade, and control of it would provide access to vital supply lines. The linchpin of this campaign was the fortress world of Gate 42, a heavily fortified stronghold. The problem was that the defenders were entrenched behind powerful fortifications and dug in for a protracted siege. Corax immediately recognized the danger of a direct frontal assault, noting that such tactics would lead to unnecessary casualties. Corax proposed a strategy of deception, infiltration, and sabotage, leveraging the Raven Guard's strengths in stealth tactics and precision strikes in order to avoid a lengthy siege. Corax planned to cripple the enemy from within and to launch diversionary strikes in order to open the way for the combined legions to sweep in with minimal losses. This was a strategy that Corax had used before with great success throughout the Great Crusade. However, Horus and Perturabo rejected Corax's proposal outright. Horus Lupercal, as War Master, preferred a rapid and decisive victory. He valued shock and awe tactics over subtlety. He saw Corax's plan as too slow, and believed that the overwhelming force of the Luna Wolves, Raven Guard, and Iron Warriors could batter down the fortress faster than sabotage could. Perturabo, known as the Master of Siege Warfare, saw this as his opportunity to demonstrate the Iron Warriors' siegecraft. He viewed the fortifications of Gate 42 as a challenge, which he could conquer to prove the superiority of his approach. For Perturabo, it was a matter of pride. He dismissed Corax's approach as cowardly, arguing that sieges required discipline, attrition, and relentless pressure, not stealth and trickery. The assault on Gate 42 went ahead according to Horus and Perturabo's plan. It was, in essence, a brute force siege, with massed frontal assaults from the Luna Wolves, Iron Warriors, and Raven Guard. The defenders of Gate 42 proved more prepared than Horus and Perturabo anticipated. They used pre-prepared kill zones and fortified choke points to inflict heavy losses on all three legions. Thousands of Space Marines died in the frontal assaults. The Iron Warriors suffered the heaviest casualties, as they were the vanguard of the assault, fitting Perturabo's belief that his legion was best suited for such tasks. And the Luna Wolves also took substantial casualties, as Horus's insistence on haste prevented the tactical caution that might have saved lives. The Raven Guard, despite Corax's objections, were forced to participate in the frontal assault, suffering grievous casualties, as their combat doctrine was poorly suited for frontal assaults. The loss of so many of his warriors in what he saw as a needless slaughter embittered Corax towards both Horus Lupercal and Perturabo. Corax viewed the campaign as one of the most senseless and avoidable losses of the Crusade. He believed that if Horus and Perturabo had listened to him, the fortress could have been taken with many fewer thousands of deaths of Astartes. The event reinforced Corax's growing sense that his legion needed to be autonomous and less reliant on cooperation with other legions. This event significantly strained Corax's relationships with both Horus and Perturabo. Horus had previously been seen as a charismatic, trusted leader by Corax, but at Gate 42, Horus's dismissal of his advice revealed to Corax that Horus was willing to sacrifice too many lives for the sake of his own glory. This event planted the first seeds of Corax's doubt in the War Master's leadership. Corax had always seen the Emperor as the ultimate authority, and for him, Horus's role as War Master was conditional. The disregard for Corax's plan signaled to him that Horus was becoming overconfident and arrogant in his authority. The divide between Corax and Perturabo was even more pronounced. While Corax was a master of guerrilla warfare, Perturabo was a master of siege warfare. Their strategic philosophies were thus completely opposed. The siege mentality of the Iron Warriors required massed assaults, attritional warfare, and slow, brutal, grinding advances. Corax, on the other hand, preferred to strike from the shadows and avoid prolonged engagements. After Gate 42, Corax viewed Perturabo as arrogant, prideful, and inflexible, while Perturabo viewed Corax as naive and cowardly. And their mutual contempt only grew over time, until, at Istvan V, they were able to fight each other for real. The Battle of Gate 42 was a moment of profound disillusionment for Corax. It led to several enduring consequences for the Raven Guard and the way Corax would conduct himself in the future. After Gate 42, Corax grew more insistent that his legion should be able to act independently of the other legions. He recognized that reliance on the broader command structure of the Great Crusade placed his warriors at risk. Corax began operating with greater autonomy, taking on missions that played to his strengths rather than following centralized commands from the War Master or other Primarchs. Corax's belief that other Primarchs were too prideful or inflexible made him withdraw from close collaboration with his brothers. He was more willing to accept input from Primarchs like Vulcan or Guilliman, who respected methodical tactics, but Horus, Perturabo, and Angron were seen as reckless warmongers. Gate 42 was thus a microcosm of the eventual betrayal at Istvan V. It was a foreshadowing. At Gate 42, Horus dismissed Corax's strategy, leading to a senseless slaughter of his marines. And then at Istvan V, it was a deliberate betrayal on the part of Horus and Perturabo that led to the near total destruction of the Raven Guard. And thus, from Corax's perspective, he had two great betrayals. Horus and Perturabo betraying him once through arrogance at Gate 42 and once through treachery at Istvan V. And so we can see that the Battle of Gate 42 had a profound psychological impact on Corax, reinforcing his belief in not trusting authority blindly. After being ignored by Horus and Perturabo to ill effect, Corax came to believe that his own judgment was more reliable than that of the War Master or other Primarchs. He reinforced his belief in precision over brute force, doubling down on his philosophy that tactical precision and guerrilla warfare were the only true ways to win without senseless slaughter. And he came to view isolation as preferable to reliance on others. Corax had his legion become even more independent, less willing to work alongside other Primarchs, lest they be dragged into tragedy. The Battle of Gate 42 was a crucible for Corax. His trust in Horus was eroded, his respect for Perturabo evaporated, and his belief in the need for self-reliance and strategic autonomy became absolute. It was a tragic precursor to the betrayal at Istvan V, and it shaped how Corax would lead the Raven Guard for the rest of the Great Crusade and into the Horus Heresy. What were the emotional needs of Corvus Corax during his period of early interstellar leadership? I think it's obvious from canon that his emotional needs during his period of early interstellar leadership must have been deeply tied to his experiences as a revolutionary liberator on Lycaeus, later called Deliverance, his intrinsic sense of justice, and his preference for operating in the shadows. These shaped his leadership style and his relationships with his legion, the Imperium, his brothers, and the Emperor. First, he needed validation of his principles and methods. Corax was deeply committed to the ideals of freedom, justice, and autonomy, values shaped by his upbringing as a revolutionary in a tyrannical system. He needed validation from the Emperor and his brothers that these ideals were not just tolerated but respected, especially as his methods often ran counter to the overtly hierarchical and authoritarian nature of the Imperium. He needed trust in his independence. Corax valued autonomy, both for himself and for his legion. He needed the Emperor and his commanders, such as Horus, to trust him, to lead in his own way, using tactics of stealth, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare that deviated from the standard doctrines of the Great Crusade. He needed recognition of his compassion. Despite his grim demeanor and methods, Corax was fundamentally empathetic. He needed acknowledgement that his fight was not simply for conquest, but to protect the oppressed and ensure justice. We'll discuss a specific battle later. Recognition of this compassion was crucial for him to feel understood and valued. Corax had a deep bond with his legion, viewing them as his comrades, his very sons. He needed a connection. He needed to maintain this connection and ensure their respect and loyalty, particularly as his ideals and methods could sometimes cause friction with more traditional or Terran-born Marines. He needed reassurance of his role in the Imperium. His sense of purpose was tied to the idea that his efforts contributed to a greater good. He needed reassurance that his role in the Great Crusade, often conducted in the shadows, was as valuable as the more overt triumphs of his brothers in the main theaters of war. Corax was introspective by nature. I feel that he needed time and space to reflect on his actions and their consequences, both for his legion and for the people they liberated. This introspection was important for his emotional balance and growth. If Corax's various emotional needs had been neglected, he may have become withdrawn and distrustful, questioning his place in the Imperium and his connection to the Emperor. Lack of trust in his independence or dismissal of his ideals might have led to alienation from his brothers or the Imperium. Over time, this could foster self-doubt, bitterness, or a sense of futility in his mission. Most notably, there was one battle that we'll talk about later, where he went to great pains to spare the lives of civilians, and then immediately afterwards, once the Raven Guard left, the Mechanicum came in and made those civilians into servitors. So, don't let him find out about that. There are a few more topics that we should mention before getting to the Horus Heresy. Internal politics within the Raven Guard, and the effect of the deaths of many Terran origin Marines at Gate 42, Corax's and the Raven Guard's treatment by the Emperor and the Emperor's opinion of them, as well as the Custodes' opinion of them and what effect a custodian advisor may have had, and any points of friction which might have pointed Corax towards chaos, what changes to his upbringing and meeting with the Emperor might have resulted in decreased loyalty. The internal politics of the Raven Guard, like in certain other legions, were most notable for the differences between Terran origin Marines and New Homeworld Marines. This dynamic was further exacerbated for the Raven Guard specifically by the Battle of Gate 42, wherein the Terran origin Marines took a great many more casualties than the Deliverance origin Raven Guard. Now, pre-Gate 42, the Terran origin Marines had been trained and formed under the early Great Crusade before Corax was found, and as with other legions, they had their own combat doctrines and traditions, influenced both by the cultural imprint of Terra and also their own genetic propensities. While the Raven Guard did have an emphasis on stealth and guerrilla tactics while they were used as auxiliaries for the Luna Wolves, the early Terran Raven Guard operated more like what we would find as covert special forces, rather than the insurrectionist resistance army, which it would be modeled after under Corax's leadership. Once Corax took control, he restructured the Raven Guard according to his philosophy of insurgency, drawn from his experience as a revolutionary leader on Lycaeus, later called Deliverance. Corax's recruits from Deliverance had, in many cases, fought alongside him, and so they often shared his ideals of guerrilla warfare, infiltration, and precision strikes from the shadows. These newer Marines were more ideologically aligned with Corax, having been raised under his vision. At the Battle of Gate 42, a substantial portion of the Terran veterans were sent into the meat grinder at Horus and Perturabo's insistence. Many of these Terran Marines had been more loyal to the old ways, viewing Corax's strategies and tactics as secondary to the original doctrines of the Legion. Their deaths thus left Corax with a legion which was increasingly composed of Deliverance-born recruits, and it removed many of the old guard commanders who might have pushed back a little against Corax's leadership style. Now, I'm not saying that the Terran origin Marines of the Raven Guard were not loyal. I'm saying that they had political differences. After the Battle of Gate 42, the survivors were drawn together by shared trauma. The losses forced greater cohesion, as the surviving Terran and Deliverance origin Marines had to unite to rebuild. This event was a shared trial-by-fire experience for the Legion, forging a post-Gate 42 Legion identity focused on adaptability, insurgency, and precise surgical strikes. Now, after the Battle of Gate 42, there was still a philosophical, political split in the Legion, which I believe ultimately resulted in the creation of the Space Sharks chapter. But that's just speculation. We're going to leave that aside. So, onto the Emperor. The Emperor's treatment of Corax was unusual and unique compared to how he handled other Primarchs. Most notably, in their first meeting. Unlike Angron or Mortarion, where the Emperor intervened directly at their final battle instead of allowing them to find their own victory, the Emperor allowed Corax to achieve victory on his own. He left. He fucking left. And he came back later, once Corax had won on his own terms. This choice reflects a belief that Corax didn't need to be saved, like Angron, and didn't need help to find victory, like Mortarion. This was the Emperor giving him a mark of respect. This was a precedent set in Corax's mind, that he was expected to be self-sufficient, having lasting effects on his personality, his later self-imposed isolation from his brothers, and the Raven Guard's relationship with the larger Imperium. After Corax's victory on Lycaeus, the Emperor personally asked Corax to become a savior, not a destroyer, suggesting that he wanted Corax to embody the ideals of a liberator rather than a conqueror, of which he already had several. And thus we can see the Emperor's expectations for the Raven Guard. He used them as insurgency specialists for asymmetric warfare. Unlike the siege-oriented Iron Warriors, the line-breaking World Eaters, or Imperial Fists, The Raven Guard were deployed as disruption forces, undermining enemy supply chains, performing clandestine sabotage, acting as a force multiplier in campaigns involving multiple legions working in concert. Now, while the Emperor clearly respected Corax's abilities, he did not have the same emotional closeness to Corax as he did with Sanguinius or Horus. This emotional distance almost certainly reinforced Corax's belief that his role was to operate in the shadows while others claimed the spotlight, and that suited him just fine. We can see a parallel here between the independence of Jagatai Khan and the independence of Corax, but let's not get too deep into that. I think it's too obvious. Now, the Custodes' view of Corax was shaped by their role as the Emperor's direct agents and observers. Now, unlike, for example, Lorgar or Angron, Corax was not viewed by the Custodes as particularly unstable or rebellious, but whatever. The Custodes had reservations about Corax's emphasis on autonomy and secrecy, which ran counter to the imperial focus on open, decisive warfare, and which made it more difficult to oversee them. Now, Corax was a disciplined and rational leader, unlike the erratic nature of Kurz or the rage-fueled insanity and unpredictability of Angron. The Custodians appreciated that, but they viewed his preference for independent operations with suspicion. As agents of the Emperor, they were trained to monitor for signs of disobedience, and he was harder to monitor since he was further away. Now, unlike the suspicions that they had towards, say, Lorgar, or Angron, or Kurz, there is little reason to believe that Corax would fall into rebellion. His commitment to justice and liberation made him unlikely to align with chaos, for one, but the Custodes may have been concerned with his potential due to his seclusion and isolation. Thus, we can see the potential importance of a custodian advisor. If a member of the Adeptus Custodes had been embedded with the Raven Guard, several changes might have occurred. The custodian could have offered advice or relayed direct orders from the Emperor, which might have alleviated Corax's growing sense of isolation. And working the communications channels the other way, they might have been able to get requests from Corax for reinforcements or information or whatnot to have a higher priority. A custodian might have been able to argue on behalf of the Raven Guard in the lead-up to Gate 42, challenging Horus's and Perturabo's plans, potentially saving thousands of Marines. The Custodes could have coordinated with the Emperor's and the War Master's overall strategy, not just at Gate 42, but like in general in the Great Crusade, ensuring that the Raven Guard weren't sidelined when they otherwise might have been able to work in concert with other legions to good effect. Now, even with the most loyal of Primarchs, it is useful to look at the potential for them to fall, because by doing so, we get a better view of how the Chaos Primarchs did fall. Despite being one of the most loyal Primarchs, I believe there are several possible paths towards chaos for Corax, if circumstances had been altered. Corax's sense of isolation was significant. If his disconnection from the Emperor had grown, he might have begun to see himself as a forgotten son. He needed some validation of what he was doing. His experience at Istvan V could have been a breaking point. Had he been more embittered by the betrayal, it's possible he could have followed a path of revenge-fueled hatred, especially if Chaos had whispered promises of power and vengeance and rapid rebuilding of numbers. If the Emperor had actively disrespected Corax's methods, much like he dismissed Lorgar's slow path on the campaign trail, Corax might have felt that his methods were devalued. This could have left him vulnerable to Chaos's influence, especially if presented with an opportunity to prove his worth over the Emperor. This is at least somewhat similar to how Perturabo actually fell, seeking an opportunity to prove himself the superior of his brothers. Despair after the massacre at Istvan V, which left him with a relative handful of surviving Marines. If Chaos had promised him a way to restore his legion, or to overcome the genetic horrors that he found when he attempted to use genetic technology to rebuild their numbers more quickly, Corax might have been tempted. His love for his legion might have been his undoing, much like how the flesh change of the Thousand Sons pushed Magnus towards the use of sorcery in an attempt to save them. Then, of course, there's the question of what if Corax had been raised in a different environment. I'm quite nurture over nature in these discussions. I think it's obvious that his worldview and potentially his loyalty to the Emperor would have been profoundly altered. What if Corax had been raised like Conrad Kurz? If Corax had grown up on a world like Nostromo, surrounded by crime and moral corruption, he might have developed a more fatalistic and nihilistic worldview. In this scenario, he might have embraced an idea of justice through terror, similar to Kurz. Without the moral foundation of the revolutionaries and political prisoners of Lycaeus who raised Corax, Corax might have instead come to believe in fear, not hope, as the ultimate tool of control. He could have been a mirror to what Kurz ended up being, a tyrant who believes himself just rather than a merciful liberator. And then there's the question of the Emperor. If the Emperor had treated Corax like he treated Angron, plucking him from his world before the battle was over, Corax certainly would have resented him for doing so. And then, if Corax had been forced into battles he believed were senseless meat grinders, like Battle 42 ended up being, the Battle of Gate 42 ended up being, if he'd been treated as a siege commander or an attrition warfare specialist under the Emperor's orders, then he may have seen the Emperor as a tyrant or an idiot. Corax is one of the most grounded, rational, and loyal of the Primarchs, but his potential for isolation, bitterness, and disillusionment cannot be ignored, and by viewing those, we can see in better light what did actually happen to some of the traitor Primarchs. His early relationship with the Emperor and his philosophical focus on liberation over conquest ended up forming the foundations of his loyalty, but it was ultimately his choices which led him to be loyal. Now, we've talked a little bit about this, but we're going to get more deep into it now. What were the effects of the Istvan V massacre, the ensuing fight to escape that trap, and Corax's mistaken attempts to use secret gene-forging techniques to rebuild? What was the effect on Corax of his inability to contribute to the defense of Terra, or to the subsequent campaign to drive the traitor legions into the Eye of Terror, the Scouring? These events, altogether, not only reshaped the legion's identity, but also Corax's. They deeply influenced Corax's psyche and his relationship with the Imperium and with his brothers. The Istvan V massacre, Horus's masterstroke, his magnum opus, was an unparalleled disaster for what became known as the Shattered Legions, the Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands, with devastating physical, strategic, and psychological consequences for those legions. Of the approximately, I'm working with numbers I believe to be canonically accurate, of the approximately 80,000 Raven Guard who deployed to Istvan V, only a few thousand survived. This near-total annihilation crippled the Legion's ability to function as a major force in the Horus Heresy. Many of the Raven Guard senior officers and experienced veterans were killed in the massacre. The survivors were mostly junior officers and newer recruits, forcing the Legion to rebuild afterwards from scratch with minimal leadership to back them up. The survivors of Istvan V endured not only horrendous combat, but also a grueling fight to escape the trap afterwards. Their betrayal by the traitor legions, particularly Horus, left them scarred and embittered. This fueled a burning hatred for the traitors, but also a deep-seated distrust of other legions, though not to the extent that the Iron Hands distrusted the Salamanders and Raven Guards specifically. Now, Corax, betrayed, became somewhat disillusioned. He had trusted his brothers, and he had trusted the War Master's vision of unity, even after Battle 42, the Battle of Gate 42. But the betrayal at Istvan V shattered this trust. Unlike Primarchs like Sanguinius, who were naturally inclined towards hope, Corax began to question the entire purpose of the Imperium, and whether the Emperor's vision had failed. Corax had survivor's guilt. He was burdened by the deaths of tens of thousands of his own sons, and also the death of his brother Ferrus Manus. His guilt was compounded by the fact that he had been unable to prevent the massacre, despite his tactical instincts and growing suspicions of Horus's intentions before the campaign. After Istvan V, in his desperation to rebuild the Raven Guard, Corax asked the Emperor for lunar technology, and he turned to cloning and gene-forging techniques recovered from the Emperor's own secret archives. This decision was a disastrous mistake. Using the genetic material stored in the Apothecarian vaults on Deliverance, Corax attempted to accelerate the creation of new space marines to replenish the Legion, but lacking the Emperor's expertise, or the expertise and specialization of the lunar gene masters, he did not have a complete understanding of the process, and so the project produced aberrant and monstrous results. They were grotesque parodies of the Space Marines, with distorted physiques, unstable minds, and enhanced aggression. We can see a vaguely similar thing happen in one of the Iron Hands novels, where they have these, half-Marines born without skin. Anyway, many of them had to be euthanized. Those who survived became a tragic reminder of the cost of desperation, eventually being killed by Corax before his disappearance. As a result of this fiasco, the surviving Marines were horrified by the results of the project. The grotesque failures caused widespread demoralization among the Raven Guard, and further isolated Corax from his own warriors. As far as I can tell in canon, Corax saw the gene-forging catastrophe as his greatest personal failure. He withdrew emotionally from his legion, haunted by the horrors he had unleashed. His guilt deepened, and his sense of isolation from both his sons and the Imperium grew. But also, let's talk about the battles of the Horus heresy. As Horus marched towards Terra, and then throughout the siege of Terra and the Soul battles, the Raven Guard were still recovering from the battles at Istvan V, as well as the gene-forging catastrophe. Corax was unable to rebuild his legion in those 7 years. He was not able to participate meaningfully in the battles of the Horus heresy and the defense of the Imperial Palace. He just didn't have the numbers. As a consequence, the Raven Guard were effectively out of the war for much of the Horus heresy, much like the Salamanders and Iron Hands. This was, of course, the point of Istvan V. That's what Horus was trying to achieve. While they conducted hit-and-run campaigns against traitor supply lines and bases, they were unable to affect the major conflicts of the heresy, and they stayed away from the major theaters of war for fear of full extinction. Corax was particularly frustrated by his inability to aid the defenders at Terra. As a Primarch who valued direct action, albeit from the shadows, this inability to contribute weighed heavily on him. Corax felt increasingly marginalized, both by circumstance and by his growing perception that the Emperor and the Imperium were moving on without him. His inability to fulfill his duty during the Imperium's darkest hour left a permanent scar on his psyche. With no means to protect Terra, Corax challenged Corax channeled his efforts into guerrilla warfare, hunting traitor forces wherever he could. He shifted the focus of the Raven Guard entirely towards revenge. This was a mistake, and they turned away from that path after he left. Now, after the Siege of Terra, Corax and the Raven Guard did play a role in the Scouring, the battles driving the traitors into the Eye of Terror, and they had some notable tactical successes. The Raven Guard excelled at hit-and-run tactics, ambushing retreating traitor forces, sabotaging their infrastructure and supply lines, and preventing them from linking up to potentially form a greater threat. However, their depleted numbers limited their ability to strike significant blows. They specifically were not able to target the main bodies of, say, the Word-Bearers to try to kill Lorgar. This left Corax frustrated by the sheer scale of the war. Even as the traitors were driven into the Eye of Terror, Corax remained haunted by the fact that his own brothers had caused such destruction and that he had been unable to stop them. The scale of the heresy reinforced his sense that the Emperor's vision of unity was inherently flawed, and by the end of the Scouring, Corax began to see the Imperium as a broken reflection of the Emperor's dream. This realization, combined with his own failures, contributed to his decision to leave the Imperium entirely. Overwhelmed by grief, guilt, and a sense of failure, Corax ultimately left the Raven Guard after the Horus Heresy, embarking on a solitary mission to hunt the traitor Primarchs, notably Lorgar. His final word to his legion, "Nevermore," was cryptic, but his departure was seen as a self-imposed punishment for what he believed to be his failures and a personal quest for redemption. The legacy of the Raven Guard, though they embraced stealth and sabotage tactics that they had been trained, their focus had somewhat shifted towards revenge and proactive defense against chaos incursions. And Corax's example inspired later generations of Raven Guard to see themselves as the Emperor's shadow warriors, striking from the darkness to protect humanity. And considering his mental state at the time that he left, it's possible that Corax's example inspired them more than his actual presence would have. The Istvan V massacre, the Gene Forger catastrophe, and the inability to defend Terra all left Corax a broken and haunted figure, defined by his failures and his isolation. For the Raven Guard, these events forged a new identity as a legion of remnants and survivors, dedicated to fighting from the shadows to uphold the Emperor's dream. Corax's legacy, though marked by tragedy, remains one of resilience and relentless commitment to justice. Now, speaking of the legacy, let's look at the deeds of the Raven Guard, how they showed further growth and development in the later 10,000 years, and what notable campaigns were most significant for them. Over the 10,000 years following the Horus Heresy, the Raven Guard underwent significant growth and evolution as they adapted to the ever-changing landscape of the Imperium and the galaxy. Despite their tragic losses during the heresy, they rebuilt their strength and refined their signature style of warfare, becoming one of the most formidable chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. Storied heroes, an inspiration for all the Imperium. Now, the Codex Astartes dictated that the Raven Guard be split into a single chapter and multiple successor chapters during what was called the Second Founding. The first founding, of course, was just the initial founding chapters. Anyway, the Raven Guard, the Raptors, etc., became heirs to Corax's legacy, maintaining his doctrines of stealth, ambush, and surgical strikes. Now, this does not include the Space Sharks. If they originated from the Raven Guard, which they may have, then they split off before Istvan V. Anyway, the Raven Guard rebuilt their numbers slowly due to the catastrophic effects of Corax's flawed gene seed experiments. But through their meticulous recruiting, gene forging practices, and careful testing, they did gradually overcome their small numbers and rebuilt. The Raven Guard and successor chapters perfected their guerrilla warfare doctrine, emphasizing stealth, infiltration, and precision strikes over direct confrontation. They became masters of the shadows, known to excel in operations where speed and stealth were critical. The chapter's emphasis on mobility and rapid deployment ensured they were always on the cutting edge of battlefield innovation, employing advanced technology like deep striking from jump packs or drop pods, reconnaissance vehicles such as modified Thunderhawks, and chameleon technology. The Raven Guard's history is filled with campaigns that highlight their unique tactics and unyielding dedication to the Emperor's vision. By looking at the later actions of the Raven Guard, we can see a gradual evolution in their strategic doctrine from their early pre-Corax campaigns, such as Hell's Anvil, their battles under Corax's command, such as Carene and Indrasul, and then their later 40K campaigns at Zypher and Baron, into the Indomitus era actions under Chapter Master Shrike, which I believe are not well documented in current canon yet. Games Workshop doesn't really know what to do with them. At Hell's Anvil, the Raven Guard fought alongside the Luna Wolves and achieved a swift victory with fewer casualties than were previously expected, due to the Raven Guard's tactics. At Carene, Corax showed a willingness to pursue vengeance even at a cost to overall strategy, which stayed with him the rest of his life. At Indrasul, Corax displayed a deep desire to have his fighting result in a merciful outcome for civilians, rather than just killing everyone and calling it victory. After achieving this difficult and great victory, he turned the world over to the Mechanicum and left, and then, not known to Corax, the Mechanicum turned them all into servitors. What the fuck? It's a good thing he never found out about that. In the Zypher and Baron conflicts, the Raven Guard showed that they could see the deeper importance of their conflicts against the Orcs, rather than just trying to kill them all through stand-up fighting as their only priority. This shows that they had outgrown Corax's obsession with vengeance. And then into the Indomitus era, Shrike has intentionally splintered the Raven Guard. Rather than fighting as one big force, they're fighting as a number of insurgent forces in asymmetric warfare. They're not a single hammer blow. Corax's influence is still deeply felt within the Raven Guard and their successors, though they seem to have successfully turned away from the obsession with vengeance, at least to some degree. The Raven Guard have remained true to Corax's teachings, continuing to fight in ways that honor his legacy as the Primarch of shadow warfare. They reject unnecessary displays of strength, favoring actions that achieve maximum effort with minimal cost. The scars of Corax's gene-forging experiments lingered, with some Raven Guard Marines displaying subtle mutations. They had, like, albino skin in later foundings, for example. But the various chapters, Apothecarian, have worked tirelessly to contain and manage these flaws, ensuring that their chapter remains combat effective. The Raven Guard have maintained their reputation as an insular and independent chapter, often operating independently of larger imperial forces. But their deep bonds of brotherhood forged through shared hardships have remained a defining feature, and they are certainly willing and capable to fight alongside imperial forces to great effect. So there was a bit in the second Battlefleet Gothic video game. Spoiler alert, you're fighting the Necrons, there's like a big world engine thing. The Raven Guard commander, whose name escapes me, uses a battle barge to like ram it and board it and set it to destroy with Exterminatus. It was great. Great mission. Anyway, in modern 40k, the Raven Guard have embraced their role as defenders of humanity, particularly those unable to defend themselves. True to Corax's ideals, the Raven Guard go out of their way to protect vulnerable populations, especially from Chaos and Xenos. Having witnessed the catastrophic effects of betrayal during the Horus Heresy, the Raven Guard rightly maintain a zero-tolerance policy towards corruption and heresy, purging any hint of it ruthlessly. The Raven Guard's actions over the millennia have solidified their reputation as one of the Emperor's most reliable tools for precision warfare. Their ability to operate in the darkest of circumstances with the strength of a chapter ensures that they remain a critical part of the Imperium's war machine. And this is going to serve them well in the new area of the Indomitus Crusade and the Imperium Nihilus. The chapter's evolution and persistence reflect the strength of Corax's legacy and the unbreakable spirit of the Raven Guard. Despite their losses, they remain true to their ideals, proving that even in darkness there is hope. Now, having examined Angron, Sanguinius, and Conrad Kors, I think I can say confidently that Sanguinius would be better paired with Kurs for a fellowship. I feel that Vulcan would work very well as an alternative with whom Angron could swap, with the World Eaters and Angron gaining quite similar benefits from the Salamanders compared to how the Blood Angels could have helped them. If you want to take a closer look at a potential Angron-Vulcan fellowship swap, especially before the World Eaters are able to recreate the Butcher's Nails, I highly encourage you to leave a comment and then go make your own video. Now that we are discussing Corax, and since we have established Sanguinius as the best option for a fellowship with Kurs, let us discuss a different potential candidate for Corax fellowship. I feel that Corax and Fulgrim pair together thematically. The celebration of freedom and the glory of rebirth. These two embody some of the Emperor's highest hopes for a post-war Imperium. These lofty ideals, paired with their differing approaches and ultimately their diverging trajectories, make their interaction a promising opportunity for our growth and learning by looking at them. Here's some initial thoughts on this pairing, and then we'll get deeper into it later. They had an aspiration for excellence. Fulgrim's relentless pursuit of perfection in all things, from martial skill to artistry, aligns with Corax's meticulous focus on achieving the best outcomes for his soldiers and for the Imperium. Both Primarchs would find common ground in these efforts to excel, though Fulgrim's perspective is more aesthetic, personal, and boastful, while Corax's is more other-oriented. He's more interested in the greater good, and he's never a boastful guy. We can see idealism in them both, rooted in the Emperor's vision. Corax's belief in the freedom of individuals, and Fulgrim's desire to elevate humanity, reflect the Emperor's vision of a better future, albeit interpreted differently. Their pairing could allow them to share their visions of the Imperium's post-war future, potentially deepening their understanding of each other and tempering their individual flaws. Fulgrim embodies the transformation of humanity through the pursuit of beauty and greatness, while Corax's focus on liberation and rebuilding speaks to a more egalitarian form of renewal. Working together could have led to a synthesis of those ideals, with Fulgrim inspiring Corax, and Corax teaching Fulgrim the values of humility and restraint. Now, they're different people, so of course there are some key differences and potentially tensions there. Corax valued freedom and despised oppression, While Fulgrim's obsession with perfection often led to rigid control and conformity, this fundamental difference could create tension, but it also offers an opportunity for both Primarchs to challenge their perspectives and grow as individuals. There is, of course, the difference of the aesthetic versus the functional. Fulgrim's fixation on beauty and elegance contrasts with Corax's more utilitarian, expedient approach to warfare. Corax might have seen Fulgrim's focus on aesthetics as frivolous, like Ferrus Manus did, honestly. Everyone thought, rightly, that Fulgrim was frivolous. But Fulgrim might have viewed Corax's vision as uninspired, sparking debates that could benefit both of them. And then the big one, pride versus humility. Fulgrim's pride, his arrogant, self-aggrandizing boastfulness in his own accomplishments and his legion's skills were, I'll say, border on arrogance, but then after he falls, it is just straight-up arrogance. Whereas Corax's humility led him to focus more on his mission than on personal glory. Their interactions might have helped Fulgrim to temper his pride, and also for Corax to develop a greater appreciation for the value of self-expression and celebration, as well as the political benefits that could be gained by self-promotion, such as more rapid access to reinforcement, intelligence, and equipment. Fulgrim might have encouraged Corax to take pride in his successes and inspire his troops through more overt or ceremonial displays of their achievements. This might have helped Corax to develop a stronger connection with his legion and fostered greater morale and loyalty. Fulgrim could have introduced Corax to the importance of beauty and art in uniting people and inspiring hope, broadening his perspective on what makes a civilization worth defending. Fulgrim's confidence and charisma could have helped Corax to overcome his self-doubt and embrace his role as a leader and symbol of the Emperor's vision. Corax, meanwhile, may have been a good influence on Fulgrim as well. Corax could have reminded Fulgrim of the dangers of excessive pride and the importance of humility, of serving others rather than seeking personal glory. He may have been able to temper Fulgrim's arrogance and help him avoid some of the pitfalls which ultimately led to his fall to chaos and Slaanesh. Corax's dedication to liberation and the welfare of the oppressed might have inspired Fulgrim to focus more on the practical needs of humanity, balancing his pursuit of perfection with compassion. Corax's disciplined approach might have helped Fulgrim to recognize the dangers of excess, whether in ambition or art and sensuous pleasure or war, steering him away from the hedonistic, arrogant path that would later consume him. Now, there are, of course, some challenges to this idea. Fulgrim's vanity might have led him to find Corax's utilitarian worldview unappealing, while Corax could have viewed Fulgrim's artistic pursuits as wasteful. Bridging this gap would require mutual respect and understanding. Fulgrim's belief in achieving greatness at any cost might have clashed with Corax's emphasis on ethical leadership and the preservation of freedom, leading to friction between them. And of course, then there's the influence of their legions. The Emperor's children, with their focus on perfection and strict hierarchy, might struggle to relate to the more egalitarian ideals of the Raven Guard and vice versa. This could create tension during their time together. To wrap up these initial thoughts, I feel that the pairing of Corax and Fulgrim gives a great deal of potential for mutual growth, but also carries substantial risks due to their contrasting philosophies and personalities. Fulgrim might have helped Corax to find joy and inspiration as a person and to find greater integration with the Imperium by self-promotion as a Primarch, while Corax might have helped to ground Fulgrim, to build his ambition on service to humanity rather than personal glory. Without careful mediation, their differences might have led to misunderstanding and conflict, making this a challenging but rewarding fellowship to explore later. Corvus Corax, with his deep sense of justice, empathy for the oppressed, and focus on liberty and self-determination, could have made a significant contribution to the Imperium's domestic administration and governance. However, his background, personality, and methods suggest he would have excelled in specific areas, rather than functioning as a broad-spectrum administrator like Guilliman. His approach would have focused on ensuring fairness, dismantling oppression, and advocating for the downtrodden within the Imperium. Corax would have been the Imperium's champion of the oppressed. Corax's formative years on Lycaeus, where he had led a rebellion against the tyranny of the overseers, shaped his deep empathy for the oppressed. In the Imperium, he could have been a powerful advocate for human rights and the welfare of the lower classes. He might have worked to dismantle exploitative systems on hive worlds and forge a more equitable society. His leadership style, which valued collaboration and individual contributions, could have fostered local governance and grassroots movements, empowering communities to govern themselves more effectively. Interestingly, he might have worked well alongside Mortarion in such efforts at reforming government. But whatever, his focus on freedom may have clashed with the Imperium's rigid hierarchy and tyrannical ways, creating tensions with more authoritarian institutions like the Arbites, or more strict bureaucracies like the Administratum. His disdain for corruption might have led to friction with planetary governors and bureaucrats who relied on exploitative practices to maintain power. He may have been a good figure for reforming and decentralizing government. Corax's belief in self-determination and his egalitarian instincts might have driven him to advocate for a decentralized model of governance, wherein planetary and regional authorities were given more autonomy within the broader framework of the Imperium. This might have alleviated some of the inefficiencies of the Imperium's bloated bureaucracy and reduced the potential for corruption. His reforms might have included policies to protect cultural identities and traditions, fostering loyalty without forced homogenization. And of course, there would have been some difficulties. The Imperium, notoriously hidebound and resistant to reform, had an ingrained need for unity and control. It would have certainly resisted such efforts at decentralization, viewing it as a potential threat to stability. Corax's preference for local solutions might not have scaled well across the galaxy-spanning Imperium, leading to inconsistencies and vulnerabilities. Corax would have been a good choice for reforming justice and anti-corruption measures. His hatred of tyranny and exploitation would have made him an ideal enforcer of justice within the Imperium, spearheading anti-corruption campaigns targeting rogue planetary governors, aristocracies, corrupt administrative officials, and oppressive local authorities. He would have also been a good choice for reforming the Arbites. His legion's stealth tactics and infiltration expertise would have been invaluable in rooting out corruption and dismantling criminal networks. His emphasis on fairness and transparency might have inspired greater trust in imperial governance. But his relentless pursuit of justice would have certainly gone up against entrenched powers within the Imperium and led to political pushback. His idealism might have led him to overestimate the willingness of others to embrace reform. Following the Gene disaster, it's possible that Corax may have been a good choice for reforming how the Imperium treats psychers and mutants. His ability to empathize with the marginalized may have been able to extend to the Psychers and mutants, ostracized groups within the Imperium. He may have been an advocate for the humane treatment of Psychers, helping to reform the systems of the Black Ships and the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, making it so that worlds are safe from the threat of the enslavers or chaos, but without mistreating Psychers just for the sake of mistreating them. His experience with genetic experimentation after Istvan V might have informed more ethical approaches to managing the Imperium's genetic diversity and the occasional mutations, various abhuman strains especially. However, if he had developed such, it would have worked against his own struggles with the mutations caused by the Raven Guard's flawed genetic experiments, would have made the role emotionally fraught. If he had pursued it, it would have drawn ire from those in the Imperium who viewed such individuals, especially Psychers, as inherently dangerous, notably Mortarion and Russ. Corax's experience in guerrilla warfare and covert operations could have also been applied to politically undermining oppressive regimes and nascent rebellions within the Imperium. He could have specialized in stealthy interventions to destabilize tyrannical groups or governments, replacing them with more equitable leadership, or also to destabilizing, fomenting rebellion within the Imperium. His focus on minimizing civilian casualties and collateral damage would have made him a more humane alternative to, for example, the Alpha Legion, or the Imperium's usual scorched earth tactics. His methods might not have aligned with the Imperium's usual overt, heavy-handed approach to governance and preventing rebellion, thus leading to conflicts with other branches of the administration. Now, we might see some limitations to his efforts. He had a distrust for bureaucracy and a disdain for authoritarian systems. This might have hindered his ability to work effectively within the Imperium's rigid hierarchy, and his tendency to focus on smaller scale, localized efforts like that of his home world might not have scaled well across the Imperium's vast territories. Plus, his deep sense of guilt and responsibility over the failures at Istvan V and rebuilding afterwards might have weighed heavily on him, making it difficult for him to fully dedicate himself to governance without being consumed by self-doubt, and that's why he went into exile in the first place. Corax's preference for working in the shadows and his aversion to the limelight might have limited his ability to inspire large-scale change or rally widespread support for his reforms. Now, if we compare him to other Primarchs, we might get a deeper view of him. Like Guilliman, Corax valued justice and governance, but he had a less centralized approach to things, and he may have focused more on empowering the oppressed. Now, like Sanguinius, Corax had a deep empathy for humanity, but he lacked Sanguinius's charisma, his public persona, or the ability to inspire hope on a grand scale. Now, with Dorn, we can see that Dorn focused on structure and fortification, but Corax emphasized flexibility, speed, movement, liberation. This works against rigid hierarchies rather than reinforcing them. Corvus Corax's contributions to the Imperium's domestic administration and governance would have been rooted in his dedication to justice, freedom, and the welfare of the oppressed. While he might have struggled within the Imperium's rigid framework, his focus on reform, anti-corruption, and empowerment of the oppressed might have created more equitable systems in localized regions of the Imperium. His idealism and focus on his own shadowy methods might have provided a counterbalance to the Imperium's more heavy-handed, overt governance. But his mistrust of authority would have kept him from becoming a central figure in its post-Horus Heresy administration. With the idea of the Fisher King, Which imperial institutions may be linked to Corax, and which failings of the Imperium might be linked thematically with his absence, his self-imposed exile? I feel that we should look for imperial institutions related to freedom, justice, and rebellion, and the failure of those ideals in the post-Horus Heresy Imperium. His story reflects the unhealed wounds of a society that prioritizes oppression and control over liberation and empowerment. And so his absence leaves a symbolic, metaphorical void where hope for reform and fairness might have flourished. The obvious choice, I feel, would be the Adeptus Arbites, as well as more localized planetary law enforcement. The Arbites' role in overseeing the enforcement of law and order could have reflected Corax's ideals of justice and rooting out corruption, ridding society of tyranny. However, instead, the institution evolved into an oppressive authoritarian force, enforcing compliance rather than protecting the innocent. Corax sought to liberate the oppressed, whereas the Arbites often suppressed rebellion and dissent, even when that dissent was justified by oppression and tyranny. His absence thus leaves the Arbites as a hollow echo of what justice in the Imperium could have been. It could have been an institution protecting humanity rather than merely controlling it. Without Corax's influence, the Arbites became overly punitive, relying on fear and brute force, instead of addressing the systemic issues which lead to rebellion. This emphasis of compliance over justice thus reflects the loss of Corax's vision for a more humane Imperium. The penal legions, the punishment organization in the Imperial Guard. Corax's early life as a liberator of the oppressed on Lycaeus could have made him an advocate for reforming the Imperium's penal systems and their use of prisoner soldiers. Instead, these systems evolved into tools of exploitation, with penal legions used as cannon fodder in the Imperium's wars. Corax might have envisioned rehabilitative justice, or alternative ways to integrate criminals into society, but his absence left the systems to stagnate into a cruel and dehumanizing machine. Penal legions exemplify the Imperium's disregard for human life, treating prisoners as disposable resources rather than individuals capable of growth and redemption. The lack of meaningful reform in the prison systems of the Imperium perpetuates cycles of rebellion and oppression, where oppression leads people to desire to rebel, and rebellion causes authorities to oppress more. These were themes that Corax may have sought to address. The bureaucracy of the hidebound administratum. Corax's emphasis on self-determination and localized governance contrasts sharply with the administratum's bloated, oppressive bureaucracy. His absence metaphorically allowed the administratum to become a sprawling, inefficient entity which crushes individuality and freedom under layers of red tape and contradictory rules. Corax might have advocated for decentralization and greater autonomy for planetary governors, fostering localized creativity and tailor-made solutions, making for more resilience in local government. The administratum's rigid control stifles innovation and fosters resentment among the Imperium's citizens. Its inefficiency and corruption exacerbate the very rebellions and uprisings that Corax might have worked to prevent through fair governance. Perhaps we might even see the influence of Corax's absence on imperial propaganda and the ecclesiarchy. Corax's message of freedom and justice could have inspired an alternative vision of imperial propaganda, one focused on hope and unity through choice rather than fear and compliance. Instead, The ecclesiarchy co-opted the narrative of sacrifice and martyrdom, transforming it from a path of empowerment into a tool of control. The absence of a figure like Corax thus left a metaphorical void, wherein the Imperium's messaging instead veered into blind fanaticism, encouraging unquestioning loyalty rather than a shared vision of a better future. The ecclesiarchy's focus on subjugation through faith and fear contrasts with Corax's ideals of personal freedom and moral responsibility. The metaphoric thematic failings of the post-heresy Imperium are easy to see. Corax's story is one of liberation and justice for the downtrodden. Therefore, his absence leaves the Imperium without a voice advocating for the marginalized, and so there is loss of hope for the oppressed in the Imperium's idea space. The Imperium's rigid hierarchy ensures that the oppressed have no champions, leaving rebellion as their only recourse. Rebellion which the Imperium then meets with ruthless suppression. Oppression? I'm not sure. Maybe either word works. The Imperium's institutions have embraced the tyranny which Corax fought against on Lycaeus and during the Great Crusade. His absence leaves unchecked the forces of oppression, turning the Imperium into a reflection of the tyrannical tech guilds that Corax despised. Corax's ideals of justice and reform have no parallel in the Imperium of 40,000. Its penal systems, legal enforcement, and governance revolve around punishment rather than redemption. There's no rehabilitative justice. That space is absent, metaphorically linked to Corax's physical absence. This ensures that the Imperium continues to treat dissent as a crime rather than addressing its root causes, perpetuating cycles of suffering and rebellion. Corax believed in self-determination, but the Imperium's structure stifles autonomy at every level, from planetary governors to individual citizens. Without Corax's influence, the Imperium became a place where freedom is seen as a threat, and conformity is enforced at all costs. In the Fisher King narrative, the land is wounded because the king is wounded. Corax's absence symbolizes the wound of the Imperium's inability to embrace justice, reform, and freedom. His legacy is a haunting reminder of what could have been a more compassionate and equitable Imperium. Instead, his ideals are twisted or ignored, leaving institutions like the Arbites and the Penal Legions to perpetuate oppression in his stead. If you would like to explore how Corax might have influenced one of these institutions had he stayed within the Imperium instead of going into self-imposed exile, had he taken on a greater role in governance especially, please leave a comment and then make your own video. What opportunities for friendship with other Primarchs may have been good options for Corax? Corvus Corax often chose the place of being an outsider due to his preference for stealth, introspection, and independence, but he had the potential to form meaningful relationships with his brothers. I feel that his sense of justice, empathy for the oppressed, and distaste for tyranny may have created opportunities for connection with Primarchs who shared similar values, or who might complement his personality. The obvious one would be Sanguinius, the angelic idealist. Both Sanguinius and Corax had a deep sense of empathy and were committed to protecting humanity, particularly the most vulnerable. Their shared ideals of justice, sacrifice, and hope could have fostered a strong bond. Sanguinius's charisma and optimism might have complemented Corax's more reserved and somber nature, helping Corax to see the brighter side of his mission. They both bore personal burdens, especially related to the genetics of their legion, with Sanguinius having to contend with the red thirst of the Blood Angels, and Corax dealing with his guilt over the Istvan V disaster, and then the later gene-forging catastrophe. They might have potentially supported each other through their struggles, at least until Sanguinius died. But that's not to say it would have been a perfect match. Corax might have viewed Sanguinius's angelic charisma with envy or unease, as Corax often felt overshadowed by his more widely admired brothers. Sanguinius's idealism could have clashed with Corax's pragmatism and willingness to use somewhat more morally ambiguous methods. I refer you back to the battle in which he allowed his need for vengeance to overcome his tactical sense. Vulcan likely would have been a good option. Vulcan's deep compassion and belief in the inherent worth of humanity would resonate with Corax's desire to protect the oppressed. Both Primarchs valued the well-being of their people and sought to minimize unnecessary suffering. Vulcan's optimism and warmth might have provided emotional support for Corax, helping to counterbalance his guilt and self-doubt. Vulcan's lack of experience with stealth and subterfuge might have created a philosophical divide, whereas Corax believed in doing whatever was necessary to achieve justice, even if those methods were somewhat quiet and led to less personal glory. Jaghatai Khan may have been a good option. He was an independent spirit. They both shared a love of freedom and self-determination, disdain for tyranny, and their legions operated in similar ways, acting independently, a bit far away from the main battles of the Great Crusade. Their shared ideals might have created a natural connection. The Khan's philosophical nature and tendency to challenge traditional authority might have resonated with Corax's own outsider status. But then the Khan's more abstract, free-spirited philosophy might have frustrated Corax, who was more grounded and pragmatic in his ideals. He didn't care so much about freedom as an abstract concept like the Khan did. Corax valued freedom as a thing that civilians could do. A potentially difficult one, Rabute Guilliman. Guilliman's focus on governance and reform may have aligned with Corax's desire to create a more just Imperium. Perhaps they might have worked together to address systemic issues like corruption and oppression. Guilliman's disciplined and structured leadership could have provided a framework for implementing Corax's ideals of justice and liberation at scale. But, on the other hand, Guilliman was closely aligned with bureaucracy and institutions and the idea of an elite, which was too close to the idea of tyranny and aristocracy. Guilliman's reliance on hierarchy and order would have clashed with Lorgar's preference for individual freedom and decentralized power. Guilliman's tendency to prioritize unity over individual expression may have caused friction in areas where Corax felt strongly about morality. And then, of course, there's Guilliman's grating personality. He may have seen Corax's methods and thought, this is just another Alfarius messing things up by not being a tiny Guilliman. Obviously, I need to fix him up. Because he was a tool. Ferrus Manus is an interesting one, but I'm not confident about this one. Work with me. Ferrus and Corax shared a practical, no-nonsense approach to achieving their goals, and they generally didn't stick around very long after achieving compliance. They left that to human organizations. Ferrus might have respected Corax's willingness to do what was necessary to achieve justice, even if it meant operating in the shadows. Whereas Ferrus's focus on strength and resilience might have helped Corax to push through his own guilt and self-doubt. However, Ferrus's black and white view of strength and weakness might have conflicted with Corax's nuanced understanding of oppression and rebellion. In Ferris's mind, if you're being oppressed, it's because you're weak. If you are unable to succeed in your rebellion, it's because you're weak. You don't deserve the freedom you seek. I didn't intend that to rhyme. Whatever. Mortarion is an interesting one. Both Mortarion and Corax shared a hatred of oppression and tyranny rooted in their upbringings on worlds dominated by brutal regimes, albeit that Corax's regime was human in origin. Mortarion's resilience and focus on survival would have resonated with Corax's desire to protect the downtrodden. And Mortarion was, in his own way, something of an idealist. However, Mortarion's grim, uncompromising worldview and his bitterness towards the Emperor might have clashed with Corax's hope for a better future, leading to friction over methods and goals. Mortarion's disdain for psychers and distrust of the warp might have made him wary of some of the methods used by the Raven Guard. Perhaps Lionel Johnson? Both Corax and Lionel Johnson shared a sense of isolation and an appreciation for operating in secrecy. Their mutual understanding of what it meant to be outsiders among their brothers could have formed the basis for a bond between them. The Lion's tactical brilliance at open warfare might have complemented Corax's expertise in guerrilla warfare, and perhaps may have inspired Lionel Johnson to form another wing of the Dark Angels to copy some of the better points of the Raven Guard's tactical philosophy. But on the other hand, the Lion's rigid sense of duty and hierarchy might have clashed with Corax's more flexible, freedom-oriented approach to leadership. We already spoke about Fulgrim. I'm not completely certain if they may have been able to become friends, but I feel that they would have benefited each other professionally. Now, meanwhile, there are some where the friendship was unlikely or ill-advised. Conrad Kurz and Corax both shared an appreciation of justice, and occasionally they both did use fear to maintain order. But Kurz's nihilism and sadism were antithetical to Corax's more compassionate and hopeful vision. They said they liked justice, but they meant different things when they used that word. Any bond between them would have been short-lived and fraught with tension. Lorgar is a bad choice. His fixation on faith and worship would have been difficult for Corax to understand or respect. Corax's pragmatic, secular mindset would have made him dismissive of Lorgar's religious fervor. And Dorn, I feel, was too much of a hierarchy-focused person to fit well with Corax's love of freedom. Overall, the key themes are that he would have done well with a brother who had empathy and shared ideals, valuing humanity and freedom, or perhaps pragmatism and complementary skills, as such brothers might have respected Corax's methods based off of their demonstrated results, leading to mutually beneficial relationships, and an outsider perspective would help. Corax's tendency to operate in the shadows and his feelings of isolation might have drawn him to other Primarchs who similarly felt out of place. Corax's friendships, had he pursued them, would have been based on shared ideals of justice, freedom, and the protection of humanity. While his reserved nature and outsider status would have made it difficult for him to form close bonds with certain Primarchs, others would have seen those same qualities and offered him the understanding and camaraderie he needed to thrive. But they needed Corax to put some effort into it. If you think you might like to explore any specific relationships between the Primarchs in greater depth, you should leave a comment and then go make your own video. To better understand Corax's emotional needs, There are some other matters which may be worth discussing. Corax's guilt and self-perception might deserve a deeper dive. Corax was known for his intense drive to improve and perfect his legion, and sometimes that meant pushing them harder than was emotionally healthy. How did this obsession with perfection interact with his guilt over his failure to save his sons? How did that manifest emotionally? How did he see himself? Did he consider himself a failure, particularly in the aftermath of the Great Scouring, where he looked ahead at an unfamiliar Imperium, wondering what his place was? What about the battle on Kievar? Corax's emotional trauma from the rebellion of some members of his own legion who were actually members of the Alpha Legion dressed up as Raven Guard. That trauma is profound. This event where his own sons turned against him in a savage mutiny left him deeply scarred. How did this betrayal affect his trust in others, particularly his own legion? Did he grow to distrust his own leadership or his own capacity for compassion and connection? Or did he rightly blame the Alpha Legion? What about the burden of leadership and the rebellion against leadership? Corax was forced to take on the mantle of leadership after the devastation of Lycaeus, and he did so with a sense of unshakable resolve. However, his emotional vulnerability to the overwhelming weight of leadership rebuilding after his rebellion could have resulted in his eventual internal rebellion against his own leadership role. How did Corax reconcile his personal struggles with the demands placed on him? Did this influence his decision to go into self-imposed exile? What about the emotional fallout from the heresy? Following the Horus heresy, Corax was in a unique position where his role as a loyalist leader and his identity deeply conflicted with each other. After failing to prevent the heresy or see it coming, did Corax feel a sense of inadequacy? How did his emotional state contribute to his isolation, particularly after his legion took so many casualties at Istvan V? Corax had complex relationships with other Primarchs, especially the other loyalists, the surviving loyalists, after the Horus heresy. Did he harbor resentment or envy of those who were more accepted or revered? How did he feel about his perceived lack of recognition compared to figures like Guilliman? Did he ever feel abandoned or unsupported by them? How did Corax's relationship with the Emperor shape his emotional responses, particularly after the Emperor's seeming disregard for his legion's plight following Istvan V? Did Corax ever feel personally betrayed by the Emperor's limited support during that moment, trying to rebuild his legion? What about the influence of the Raven Guard's culture on Corax? The Raven Guard were already known for their focus on secrecy, guerrilla tactics, and subterfuge while working alongside the Luna Wolves. How did this environment, particularly in terms of distrust of a newcomer, influence Corax emotionally? Did his need for secrecy or the feeling of being misunderstood contribute to his tendency to keep to himself or act independently? Like many of the Primarchs, who we've discussed already, Corax was deeply tied to a sense of justice, but unlike some of them, he also had a desire for vengeance rooted in personal losses, which we can see in some of the canonical battles and such. How did this vengeance affect his emotional stability? Did it feed into his internal struggles, especially in the wake of his own failures and the loss of so many of his legion? What about the Raven Guard's emotional fallout post-heresy? After the Horus heresy and after the Alpha Legion showed their hand in the rebellion, how did Corax process the emotional wounds left on his legion, especially considering their losses? How did the emotional toll of the war and his failure to participate in the main theaters of the conflict manifest in the actions and leadership of the legion afterward? Any of these topics could shed light on the emotional complexity of Corax, particularly in relation to his leadership, relationships, guilt, and struggles with failure. Feel free to leave a comment about whichever topic appeals to you, and then go and make your own darn video.